The carriage wheels stopped turning at the exact moment Nora Vane's courage nearly failed her. Fog rolled off the hills in slow grey waves, thick enough to swallow the towers of Oakhaven Keep whole. She could hear the estate before she could see it properly. The clang of iron, the low rumble of men's voices, the crack of a whip somewhere near the stables, urging a tired horse forward. Nora gathered her skirts, stepped down onto the gravel, and told herself firmly that a girl who had grown up gutting fish on a Cornish dock had no business being frightened of a house, however large. She was wrong. Oakhaven was not a house. It was a small kingdom of stone and smoke, sprawled across the valley like something that had grown there rather than been built, and somewhere within its walls, 40 hungry men were waiting for their supper. "You're late," said the housekeeper, a thin woman named Mrs. Pruitt with a face like a closed door. "The stonemasons finish at 8. The ironworkers come in after. You'll have both fed by 9, or Mr. Sterling will hear of it." Nora did not ask who Mr. Sterling was. She had learned long ago that the first rule of any kitchen was to cook first and ask questions later. So she rolled her sleeves to the elbow, tied on an apron that smelled of someone else's lard, and set to work. The kitchen at Oakhaven was a cavern of blackened copper pots and groaning spits, lit by tallow candles that guttered whenever the door swung open to the yard. Nora found 3 kitchen girls hiding near the scullery, too afraid of the evening's chaos to move, and put them to chopping onions and turnips before they could protest. She had brought her own recipe for a labourer's stew, thick with barley, dark with beef and root vegetable, seasoned with whatever herbs the estate garden could still offer in late autumn, and by the time the great bell rang for supper, 6 iron cauldrons of it stood steaming and ready. The men came in like a flood breaking a dam. Stonemasons first, caked in white quarry dust that turned to paste on their sweating necks. Then the ironworkers, blacker still, smelling of coal smoke and hot metal, dropping onto the long benches with the particular exhaustion of men who had spent the day fighting stubborn material into submission. Nora ladled stew until her arm ached, cut bread until her knuckles bled from the crust, and answered demand after demand for more, with the calm of someone who had done this 1,000 times before, in 100 other kitchens, for 100 other masters. By 11, the hall had thinned to a scatter of stragglers. By midnight, it was nearly empty, the fires burning low, the benches scarred with spilled ale and dropped crumbs. Nora sat on an upturned crate near the hearth, finally allowing herself a moment's rest, when she noticed him. He sat alone at the very end of the longest bench, furthest from the fire, in the coldest and darkest corner of the hall. A thin man, not old but not young either, wrapped in a wool coat so threadbare that the elbows had gone shiny and grey. His boots were caked in dried limestone dust, the same as the quarrymen, and his hands, folded loosely around a chipped wooden bowl, were rough and calloused in a way that spoke of real labour rather than borrowed appearance. He did not speak to anyone. He did not seem to expect anyone to speak to him. Nora watched, curious despite her exhaustion, as he lifted the last of his bread and wiped it slowly around the inside of the bowl, gathering every trace of broth left behind by the men who had eaten before him. He ate the crusts that others had abandoned on the table, the ones too hard or too burnt for anyone else to bother with, chewing them with the patient thoroughness of a man who had once known real hunger and never quite forgot the lesson. When he finished, he did something none of the other labourers had done all evening. He rose, carried his own bowl to the washing trough, rinsed it himself with careful, unhurried hands, and set it upside down to dry beside the others. Then he pulled his collar up against the cold and walked out into the fog without a single word to anyone, without so much as a glance toward the fire he might have warmed himself by. Nora sat very still after the door closed behind him. There was nothing remarkable about a quiet man finishing his supper alone. Oakhaven was full of tired, silent labourers who kept to themselves after a long day's work. And yet something about him, the way he had washed his own bowl when no one required it of him, the careful economy of his movements, the way his eyes had swept the room once before he sat, as though counting every soul present, pricked at Nora's attention like a splinter she could not quite locate. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself she was tired, and strangers were always strange on a first night in a new place, and there was nothing more to it than a hungry man eating his fill in peace. She was wrong about that, too. But it would be many weeks yet before she understood exactly how wrong, and by then, the truth would already be far too close to ignore. By the 14th day, Nora had stopped thinking about the quiet man from the bench and started thinking about her flour.
It was Tabitha, the youngest of the kitchen girls, who first pointed out the trouble.
"We've gone through near 2 full sacks this week, ma'am, and I've not baked half what I did last Tuesday."
Nora had brushed it off at first. A new kitchen, new hands, new waste. But she kept her own tally now, the way her mother had taught her on the Cornish docks, where every scrap of flour meant the difference between a full winter and a lean one. The numbers did not sit right. Flour vanished faster than her recipes called for. So did salted beef, and the good butter kept for the steward's table. She checked the delivery book twice, then a third time by candlelight, after the girls had gone to bed, and each time the sums refused to match. Either the supply carts were shorting her, or someone inside Oakhaven's walls was taking more than their share. She decided to see for herself where the supplies actually went.
The following morning, before the bell rang for breakfast, Nora wrapped a shawl tight around her shoulders and followed the supply wagon down the valley road instead of waiting in the kitchen for it to arrive. The track wound along the ridge for near 2 miles, past hedgerows silvered with frost, until the ground opened into a wide gray scar cut into the hillside, the quarry, where Oakhaven's stone was cut and hauled for the estate's endless building works. She had never seen it up close before. The noise struck her first, the ring of chisels against granite, the groan of ropes straining under weight, men shouting orders back and forth across the pit. Dust hung in the air like a second fog, coating everything pale gray so that the workers themselves seemed carved from the same stone they cut. Nora found the storage shed near the quarry's edge, where sacks of flour and barrels of salted meat sat stacked beside coils of rope and iron tools.
She counted the sacks against what the ledger claimed had been delivered and found the same gap she'd found in her kitchen books. Supplies logged as used that had never reached a single pot. She was still counting when she saw him. He stood among the laborers hauling a great block of dressed granite onto a wooden sled, his sleeves rolled past the elbow despite the cold, his hands pressed flat against the stone, as though he could feel exactly where its weight wanted to shift. He called out no orders, yet the men around him seemed to move at his pace rather than their own, adjusting their grips a half-second before he gestured, as if they had worked beside him long enough to read his silences. His coat was the same threadbare wool from that first night in the kitchen. His hands, calloused and pale with limestone dust, moved with a precision that struck Nora as strange for a common laborer. Not the rough strength of a man who simply lifted what he was told to lift, but something closer to care, the way she herself handled the blade she trusted. She watched him work for longer than she meant to. When the block finally settled onto the sled without so much as a crack along its edge, the quarrymen around him let out a low murmur of relief, and one clapped him once on the shoulder before returning to his own task. The quiet man said nothing in return. He simply wiped his palms against his coat and turned back toward the rock face, already searching for the next stone that needed cutting. Nora found herself reaching into her basket before she had fully decided to. She had brought a hand pie meant for her own midday meal, wrapped in a scrap of cloth, still faintly warm from the kitchen fire.
She set it on the edge of the workbench nearest him, where he would find it without her having to speak a word, and turned to leave before he noticed her at all. She was halfway back up the quarry path when she glanced over her shoulder and saw him lift the cloth, look at the pie, then lift his eyes toward the path she'd taken. He did not call out. He only inclined his head, the smallest motion, more felt than seen, and Nora found herself smiling, despite the cold biting at her fingers. She walked the 2 miles back to Oakhaven, turning the ledger's numbers over in her mind, certain now that whatever was draining her stores had nothing to do with careless cooking or greedy kitchen girls. Someone at Oakhaven was skimming supplies meant for the estate, and doing it carefully enough that only a woman who counted every last spoonful of flour would ever notice the gap. She thought, too, of the quiet man at the quarry, his calloused hands moving with such unlikely precision over stone.
A common laborer, she told herself, nothing more. A man who worked hard and ate what others left behind and asked for nothing in return. It would be many weeks before she learned how carefully that impression had been built, and how much of it had been built for her benefit alone. Rain came without warning on the 32nd day, the kind of sudden downpour that Cornish folk called a sky break, and it caught Nora a full mile from Oakhaven with a basket of dried thyme and rosemary she'd walked to the village to buy. She ran for the nearest shelter she knew, a disused watermill sitting at the bend of the stream below the ridge, its great wheel long since stopped turning, moss creeping up its stone foundations. The estate had abandoned the mill years before, Mrs. Pruitt had told her once, after a newer one was built closer to the granaries, and nobody had much use for the old building beyond storing broken carts and forgotten tools. Nora pushed through the door, soaked to the bone, expecting an empty room and the smell of damp timber. Instead, she found a small fire burning low in the old hearth, and the quiet man from the quarry sitting cross-legged beside it, a sheet of parchment spread flat across his knee. He looked up at her sudden entrance with none of the alarm she expected. If anything, he seemed almost to have been waiting, though Nora told herself that was foolishness. No one waited for a storm, and certainly no one waited for her. "Forgive the intrusion," she said, water dripping from the hem of her skirt onto the stone floor. "I didn't know the mill had a fire in it these days." He said nothing at first, only shifted along the hearth to make room, and gestured toward the flames with an open palm. Nora took the invitation, setting her basket down and holding her hands to the warmth, grateful enough for shelter that she didn't press him for conversation he clearly wasn't inclined to give. It was only once her eyes adjusted to the dim light that she noticed what lay across his knee. Not idle scratchings as she'd first assumed, but careful lines drawn in graphite. The curve of an archway, measured and precise, with small numbers marked along its edges, and a second sketch beside it showing the same arch from a different angle, as though he were working out from every side how the stone might hold its own weight. "That's fine work," Nora said, nodding toward the parchment. "Copying a master's drawings, are you? For one of the stonemasons?" He glanced down at the sketch, as though he'd forgotten it was there, then rolled it loosely and set it aside without answering her question directly. "Something of the sort," he said instead, his voice low and unhurried, the first full sentence she'd heard him speak in over a month at Oakhaven. It struck her as odd even then, a common laborer bent over technical drawings by firelight, sketching structural detail with a patience she'd never seen in the quarrymen who simply followed whatever plans were handed down to them. But Nora had grown up around fishermen who mended their own nets with surprising delicacy, and blacksmiths who carved small toys for their children in idle hours. And she told herself, a man's hands could hold more than one kind of skill without there being any great mystery in it. Perhaps he was apprenticed to someone who couldn't read the plans himself and needed them copied plain. Perhaps he simply liked to draw, the way some men liked to whittle. Her basket of dried sacks had taken the worst of the rain, and she busied herself laying the herb bundles near the fire to dry, grateful for something to occupy her hands while the storm rattled the mill's old shutters. The quiet man watched her work for a moment, then rose without a word, crossed to a shelf near the millstone, and returned with a small tin flask. "Tea," he said, offering it toward her. "Still warm, I think." She took it, surprised at the small kindness, and found it was indeed warm, steeped dark and strong the way sailors drank it back home, rather than the pale, milky brew served in Oakhaven's servants' hall. She drank gratefully, then passed it back to him, and he drank in turn, without wiping the rim first,
an easy familiarity that told her he thought little of sharing a flask with a cook he barely knew.
You don't talk much,
she said finally, when the silence had stretched long enough that she no longer felt awkward filling it.
Down at the hall, up at the quarry, barely a word out of you most days.
There's not much worth saying most days, he answered, feeding a fresh stick into the fire. Rock needs cutting, stew needs eating, little else requires comment. Nora laughed at that, a short, surprised sound, and thought she caught the ghost of something like amusement cross his face before it settled back into stillness. And drawing archways by firelight? Does that require comment? Only if someone asks, he said, and this time there was no mistaking the small curve at the corner of his mouth. They sat through the worst of the storm that way, trading little scraps of talk between long silences that didn't feel uncomfortable so much as companionable, the fire cracking and the rain hammering the old mill roof.
Nora told him about the coast, about her mother's fish stews and the sound gulls made at dawn, and he listened with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything, offering little of himself in return beyond the occasional dry remark that made her laugh despite herself. When the rain finally eased to a drizzle, she gathered her dried herbs and made ready to leave, the walk back to Oakhaven still ahead of her in the fading gray light. At the door, she paused and looked back at him, still seated by the dying fire, with his rolled parchment resting near his knee. "What's your name?" she asked. "I've been calling you the quiet man in my head for a month now, and it seems only right to know better." He considered the question longer than it deserved, as though weighing something she couldn't see. "Julian," he said at last. "Just Julian will do." "Just Nora, then," she replied, and stepped back out into the drizzle, leaving him to his fire and his drawings.
She walked home, turning his name over alongside everything else she'd noticed. The careful hands, the precise sketches, the way he seemed to weigh every word before spending it, as though speech itself were a resource he rationed as carefully as she rationed flour. She still believed him a laborer, still believed the drawings belonged to some master he copied for, and told herself there was nothing stranger in a quiet man than in any other soul who kept his own counsel. She would remember that walk home often in the months that followed, and wonder how she had come so close to the truth without once reaching far enough to grasp it. By the 58th day, Nora had learned enough about Oakhaven's rhythms to know that Silas Sterling rarely left the keep himself. The steward preferred to summon others to him, seated behind his tidy desk with its rows of ledgers, rather than trouble his boots with mud. So when he asked her directly to accompany him down to the river docks to inspect the winter provisions, she understood it as something closer to an order than an invitation. "The cook ought to see what she's working with before it reaches her kitchen," he said, pulling on a heavy driving coat against the cold. "Waste has a habit of happening between the wagon and the larder, and I'd rather it not happen on my account." Nora thought the remark strange, coming from the very man whose ledgers never quite matched her own count of flour and salted beef, but she said nothing, only climbed into the trap beside him and settled her shawl tight against the wind coming off the water. The docks sat a good hour's ride from Oakhaven, where the river widened enough for flat-bottomed barges to unload their cargo before the goods were carted up the valley road. Nora had never seen the place before and found it busier than she expected. Casks and crates stacked along the wharf, dockhands calling to one another over the creak of rope and timber, the whole scene smelling of tar and cold river mud. Sterling left her near the cart while he strode toward a broad-shouldered man in an oilskin coat, clearly the captain of one of the moored barges, and Nora, curious despite herself, drifted close enough to catch their exchange without appearing to listen at all. "3 shipments short this month," Sterling was saying, his voice pitched low but sharp with irritation. "Timber and iron beams both, marked as delivered against my own manifest. I want to know where they've gone before the estate's auditors come asking." "I've delivered every plank and beam handed to me, sir," the captain answered, folding his arms. "What happens to it after it leaves my barge is none of my concern.
You'll find no fault with my manifest. Then explain to me how the keep's expansion sits 3 months behind schedule, with half its materials unaccounted for, Sterling snapped, and for a moment Nora thought he might strike the man, so tight had his voice gone.
The captain shrugged, unmoved by the steward's temper. Perhaps your own men know better than I do, Mr. Sterling. I only carry what's loaded onto my deck. Sterling turned away from the argument with a face like a closed fist, and Nora busied herself examining a crate of salted cod before he noticed how near she'd stood. She said nothing of it during the ride home, only watched him from the corner of her eye as he stared out at the passing hedgerows, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming an uneasy rhythm against his knee. Timber and iron beams, gone missing between the docks and the keep. She thought of her own missing flour, her own missing beef, and wondered whether the two mysteries might share a single root. That evening, once the supper crowd had thinned and the last of the stragglers had drifted out into the dark, Nora found Julian seated in his usual corner, finishing the dregs of his stew with the same unhurried patience she'd come to expect of him. She waited until the hall stood nearly empty before crossing to sit across from him, close enough to speak without being overheard. "I went to the docks today," she said without preamble, watching his face for any flicker of reaction. "Mr. Sterling was shouting at a barge captain about missing timber. Iron beams, too, meant for the keep's expansion." Julian's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly, and for the first time since she'd known him, Nora saw something sharpen behind his eyes. Not surprise, she thought, but a kind of careful attention, as though he were deciding how much of what she'd said he already knew. "Have you noticed anything missing up at the quarry?" she pressed, keeping her voice low. "Stone unaccounted for? Tools that vanish and never turn up again? I've been keeping my own count in the kitchen for weeks now. The numbers never sit right, no matter how I add them." He didn't answer at once. He studied her the way she'd seen him study a block of granite before deciding where to strike it, weighing something she couldn't name, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped lower still. "There's more missing from that quarry than anyone up top cares to notice," he said. "Cut stone marked for delivery that never leaves the yard, tools logged as broken that turn up whole in other men's hands a fortnight later." Nora's stomach tightened. "You think someone's stealing it, selling it off before it ever reaches the keep?" He gave her a single nod, sharp and deliberate, the same calculating look she remembered from that first suspicion at the quarry weeks before, and something in the gesture told her he had already turned the same thought over in his own mind long before she'd spoken it aloud. "Someone with enough authority to alter the ledgers without question," he said quietly. "Someone whose word nobody thinks to doubt." Nora thought of Sterling's face at the docks, tight with an anger that had seemed almost too convenient, too well-timed for a man simply frustrated by another's carelessness. She thought of his ledgers that never quite matched her own count, his insistence on inspecting the docks himself rather than sending a servant in his place. "You think it's him," she said. "Sterling." Julian didn't confirm it outright. He only picked his spoon back up, finished the last of his broth, and rose to carry his bowl to the trough, as he always did, leaving Nora sitting alone with the weight of a suspicion neither of them had dared to speak plainly. But as he reached the door, he paused and looked back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read in the dim firelight. "Keep your counting quiet, Nora," he said. "A man who steals carefully doesn't take kindly to being watched." Then he was gone into the dark, and Nora sat alone by the dying fire, certain now that whatever mystery lay beneath Oakhaven's ledgers ran far deeper than missing flour and salted beef. Sleep had grown thin for Nora since the trip to the docks, her mind turning over ledgers and missing timber long after the kitchen fires had banked down for the night. On the 75th day, unable to settle, she took a candle and went searching through the keep's east wing for an old cookbook Mrs. Pruitt had once mentioned, a battered volume of preserves and winter recipes said to be tucked away in the estate archives, useful now that the cold months pressed closer
and her own stores needed stretching further than usual. The East Wing at night was a different creature from the busy kitchens and mess halls she knew. Corridors stretched long and silent, lined with portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow her candle's small light, and the floorboards creaked underfoot in a way that made her walk softer than she meant to. She found the archive room easily enough, a cramped chamber stacked with dusty ledgers and estate records going back further than she cared to guess, but no cookbook among them worth the trouble. It was on her way back that she noticed the lamp. A thin line of yellow light showed beneath a door she'd never had cause to open before, set apart from the rest by its heavy iron lock and the estate crest carved into the wood above the frame. She knew, without needing to ask, that this was the architectural study, the room where the keep's building plans and construction accounts were said to be kept, always locked, always dark at this hour on every previous night she'd passed it.
Curiosity got the better of caution. Nora crept closer, candle shielded behind her hand, and pressed her eye to the keyhole. What she saw stopped her breath in her throat. Julian sat at a high mahogany desk within, his threadbare wool coat cast aside over the back of his chair, a pair of fine reading spectacles perched on his nose. Spread before him lay a scatter of papers, her own kitchen ledgers, the very ones she kept locked in the pantry cupboard, sitting alongside a stack of official construction invoices bearing Sterling's careful hand. He moved between the two sets of records with quick, practiced eyes, comparing figures, marking small notes in the margins of a fresh sheet with a steadiness that spoke of long familiarity with such work. This was not a laborer glancing over borrowed drafts by firelight. This was a man who read numbers the way she read a recipe, fluent and exact, cross-referencing sums that Nora herself had spent weeks puzzling over with nothing but a candle stub and her own uncertain arithmetic. She drew back from the keyhole slowly, her heart hammering louder than seemed reasonable for so quiet a discovery. 100 small oddities rearranged themselves in her mind at once. The precise archway sketches at the mill, the sharp, calculating look he'd given her at the mention of missing timber, the way the quarryman moved to his rhythm without waiting for spoken orders. She had told herself each one meant nothing on its own. Together, in the lamplight through a locked door, they meant a great deal indeed. "Who are you?" she thought, staring at the thin gold line beneath the door as though it might answer her. She did not knock. Some instinct held her back from announcing herself outright, a caution she couldn't fully explain even to herself, beyond a feeling that whatever she'd stumbled upon was not yet hers to name aloud. Instead, she crept back to the kitchens, retrieved her own private tally from the pantry cupboard where she kept it hidden from Mrs. Pruitt's disapproving eye, and returned to the locked study with careful, quiet steps. She tore a fresh page from the back of her ledger and wrote quickly by candlelight, her hand none too steady. Flour and salted beef, both short of what the deliveries claim, weeks running. I have kept my own count since the first fortnight. If it is of use to whatever you are working at behind that door, you are welcome to it. N.V. She folded the note twice, knelt at the base of the door, and slid it beneath the gap where the yellow lamplight spilled out onto the corridor floor. For a long moment, nothing happened, and Nora held her breath, half expecting the door to swing open and reveal whatever truth waited behind it. It didn't. She heard only the faint scrape of the note being drawn inward, followed by a stillness that told her the man within had paused in his work to read it. Nora did not wait to see more. She turned and walked back through the silent corridors with her candle guttering low, her thoughts racing far ahead of her feet. Whatever Julian truly was, whoever he truly was, he was no common laborer sketching another man's drawings by firelight, no simple quarryman hauling stone for wages. A man who cross-referenced kitchen ledgers against construction invoices with such fluent care was investigating something, and investigating it in secret, behind a locked door bearing the estate's own crest. She thought of Sterling's tight, furious face at the docks, his ledgers that never matched her count,
his insistence on inspecting shipments himself rather than trusting a servant's word. If Julian suspected the same theft she did, then perhaps her own careful tally of missing flour and beef was not so small a thing after all. Perhaps it was one thread in a far larger tangle that reached from her kitchen pantry all the way to the timber and iron vanishing from the riverside docks. She reached her small room near the kitchens and sat on the edge of her narrow bed, candle burning low, sleep further from her now than it had been all evening. Whoever Julian truly was beneath that threadbare coat, he had chosen, for reasons she could not yet guess, to hide it carefully enough that even the sharp-eyed Mrs. Pruitt had never once looked at him twice.
Nora blew out her candle at last, but lay awake a long while in the dark, turning over the image of him bent over her ledgers with spectacles on his nose, and wondering just how much more of Oakhaven's quiet man remained hidden from her still. The frost came hard and sudden on the 92nd day, hard enough to crack the old timber bridge at St. Jude's Ravine Pass where it crossed the gorge on the North Road. Word reached Oakhaven just past dawn, carried by a breathless stable boy who'd ridden the whole way without stopping. A supply carriage bound for the keep had been crossing when the frost-weakened beams gave way beneath it, and now sat stranded on the ravine's far edge, its wheels half sunk into broken timber, its cargo of spices and winter grain hanging in the balance should the rest of the structure fail. Mrs. Pruitt sent Nora along with the rescue party without much explanation beyond the obvious need for someone to see to the men's food and warmth once the carriage was recovered. Nora didn't argue. She packed what bread and hot broth she could carry, wrapped herself against the biting cold, and climbed into the cart with the stonemasons and ironworkers Sterling had hastily assembled, all of them grim-faced at the prospect of losing a season's grain to a broken bridge. The pass itself was a narrow gash in the hillside, steep on both sides, with the ravine dropping a good 30 feet to a frozen stream below. The carriage sat exactly as described, tilted at a dangerous angle where the bridge's central span had splintered, its front wheels resting on nothing but a few remaining beams that groaned audibly under the weight whenever the wind gusted through the gorge. The men who'd arrived ahead of Nora's cart stood in a loose, uncertain knot near the ravine's edge, arguing over how best to approach the wreck without sending the whole carriage tumbling into the frozen stream below. Ropes had been brought, along with timber and iron pins, but nobody among them seemed quite certain how the pieces ought to fit together, and precious minutes bled away in shouted disagreement while the bridge continued its slow, ominous creaking. Then Julian arrived on foot, having walked the last mile from the quarry rather than wait for a cart, and the argument stopped almost the instant he stepped into the gorge. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He walked the length of the broken span twice, studying the angle of the remaining beams with the same careful attention Nora had seen him give an archway sketch by firelight, then began issuing instructions in a low, even tone that the men followed without a single word of protest, an authority Nora had never once seen him claim, yet one the quarryman seemed to accept as though they'd always known it lived in him. "Rope there and there," he said, pointing to 2 points along the ravine's edge. "Not the carriage itself, mind, the axle beneath it, else you'll tear the wheels clean off and lose the grain regardless. Timber under the front span, wedged at an angle, not flat. Flat wood snaps under this weight. Angled wood bears it." The men moved at his direction with a speed that surprised even Nora, hauling timber into place, threading rope beneath the carriage's axle exactly as he'd described. Julian himself climbed down onto the broken span, testing each beam's give with his own weight before trusting a single rope to it, his calm entirely unshaken even as the whole structure groaned beneath his boots. Nora watched from the ravine's edge, forgetting the broth she'd carried, forgetting the cold entirely. This was no laborer's instinct, however sharp. This was calculation of a kind she'd only ever seen in the pages of engineering texts glimpsed once in a merchant's shop window back home. The careful use of leverage, of angles and weight distribution, applied with a precision that spoke of years spent studying exactly how stone and timber bore their burdens. "Pull!" Julian called at last, once the ropes and timber wedges sat exactly to his liking, and the men hauled together in a single, coordinated heave. The carriage groaned, tilted further for one heart-stopping moment, then rose slowly free of the broken span, its wheels finding purchase on the solid ground beyond the gorge's worst damage. A ragged cheer went up from the assembled workers, relief plain on every frost-reddened face, and even Julian allowed himself the faintest exhale of satisfaction before turning back to inspect the remaining structure for any further danger. Nora finally remembered the broth and busied herself pouring cups for the exhausted men, grateful for the excuse to steady her own racing thoughts. She had told herself for months that Julian was simply a skilled laborer, a man whose quiet competence exceeded his station but remained, at its core, ordinary. What she'd just witnessed was not ordinary. No common quarryman commanded a rescue with such fluent authority, calculating stress and leverage as easily as she calculated flour against a recipe. When the last of the carriage's cargo had been secured and the men began the walk back toward Oakhaven, Nora found herself falling into step beside Julian, unable to hold her tongue any longer. "That wasn't quarry work," she said quietly, keeping her voice low enough that the others wouldn't hear. "What you did back there, angling the timber just so, knowing exactly where the weight would give and where it wouldn't, that's not something a man learns hauling stone." Julian kept his eyes forward, his pace steady, and for a long moment Nora thought he might simply let the observation pass unanswered, the way he'd let so many others pass before. "A man learns a great many things," he said instead, "when he's spent long enough watching what holds and what breaks." It was no real answer, and they both seemed to know it, yet something in his tone kept Nora from pressing further, some sense that whatever truth lay behind his careful competence was not one he meant to surrender easily. She walked the rest of the way back to Oakhaven in thoughtful silence, turning over everything she'd witnessed at St. Jude's Pass, and found herself more certain than ever that Oakhaven's quiet man was not remotely what he appeared to be. By the 115th day, Nora's careful tally had grown thick enough to fill half a ledger of her own, every missing pound of butter and every short delivery of salt logged beside the date she'd noticed it. Winter had settled fully over Oakhaven now, and with the cold came fresh trouble in the preserved stores. Casks of salted butter turning up lighter than the delivery notes claimed, sacks of coarse salt vanishing from the vaulted cellars beneath the keep, where the estate kept its winter provisions safe from frost. She went down to the cellars herself one grey afternoon, candle in hand, determined to see the discrepancy with her own eyes rather than trust Mrs. Pruitt's dismissive shrug that stores always ran short come winter. The cellar stretched further than she'd expected, rows of wine casks lining the walls in dusty ranks, the air thick with the smell of damp stone and old oak. She counted the butter casks first, finding the same gap she'd already suspected, then moved deeper into the vault, where the older wine stores sat undisturbed behind newer stock. It was there, wedged behind a row of casks pushed slightly out from the wall, that she found the crates. Nora knelt and pried one open, expecting nothing more than forgotten bottles, and instead found brass fittings packed in straw, gleaming and new, along with lengths of architectural lead stacked beneath them. Exactly the sort of material Sterling had shouted about missing from the docks months before. Her breath caught. This was no accident of poor record-keeping. Someone had hidden stolen goods within the estate's own cellars, tucked behind wine casks where no one thought to look. "You found rather more than butter, I see." Sterling's voice came from the cellar stairs, calm in a way that chilled Nora far more than shouting would have. He descended slowly, a lamp in one hand, his other resting near the heavy door that sealed the vault from the corridor above. "Mr. Sterling," Nora said, rising to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs. "This is rather more trouble than a cook ought to concern herself with," he finished for her, his tone still mild, though his eyes had gone hard and calculating in the lamplight. "You've a fine talent for counting, Miss Vane. A pity you couldn't have kept it to your own pantry." She backed a step further into the vault without quite meaning to, and Sterling's gaze followed her movement with the patient attention of a man who had already decided how this evening would end. "You've been stealing from the estate," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "The timber, the iron beams, all of it, and now the lead and brass besides." "Stealing implies I've taken something not already owed me," Sterling said, setting his lamp on a nearby barrel with unhurried care. 10 years I've managed this estate's accounts while a distant heir played at whatever business kept him from ever once setting foot here. A man grows tired of managing another's fortune for a servant's wage. He moved toward the heavy cellar door as he spoke, and Nora understood his intention a half-second before he acted on it. She lunged forward, but the door swung shut before she reached it, the great iron bolt sliding home with a sound that echoed through the vaulted stone like a closing coffin lid. "Mr. Sterling!" She pounded against the timber, her voice rising despite herself. "Let me out this instant!" "I've a carriage to arrange and a fortnight's head start to secure," he called through the door, his footsteps already retreating up the stairs. "By the time anyone thinks to search the cellars, Miss Vane, I'll be well beyond England's shores, and you'll have all the time in the world to count what remains." Nora's pulse roared in her ears as his footsteps faded entirely, leaving her alone in the cold dark with nothing but a guttering candle and crates of stolen brass for company. She threw her weight against the door twice, uselessly, before forcing herself to breathe, to think, rather than waste her strength on timber that would not yield to her alone. It was the scrape of the bolt sliding back that made her spin around, half expecting Sterling return to gloat further. Instead, Julian stood in the open doorway, his face unusually grim in the lamplight, one hand still resting on the heavy iron bolt he'd unfastened as easily as another man might lift a latch. "He's making for the stables," Julian said, stepping into the vault and taking swift stock of the hidden crates with a single sweeping glance. "I saw him crossing the yard in too great a hurry for an honest errand." "He locked me in," Nora said, her voice unsteady despite her best effort to hold it level. "He means to flee the country entirely, Julian, tonight, before anyone can stop him." "He won't get far," Julian said, and something in his voice had changed entirely from the quiet, careful man she'd known these 5 months, cold now and certain, carrying an authority that brooked no argument whatsoever. "Stay here. Lock the door behind me if you must, and let no one but myself or Mrs. Pruitt open it again." He was gone before she could question him further, moving with a swiftness up the cellar stairs that left her staring after him in the lamplight, the crates of stolen brass and lead sitting silent and damning at her feet. Nora stood alone amid the evidence of Sterling's theft, her heart still racing, and found herself wondering, not for the first time, exactly what manner of man had just unfastened an iron bolt with such effortless ease and spoken with such unquestionable command. Whoever Julian truly was beneath his threadbare coat, she understood now beyond any doubt that the truth waiting to be revealed was far greater than a skilled laborer's hidden talent. She would learn the whole of it before another day had passed, and nothing in her 5 months at Oakhaven had prepared her for how far the truth would reach. Word spread through Oakhaven faster than frost across a window pane. By morning, the whole estate knew that Silas Sterling had been caught fleeing toward the coast road in the dead of night, his carriage loaded with strong boxes far heavier than any honest man's savings ought to be, and that estate auditors and the local magistrate had already been summoned to the keep to settle the matter properly. Nora had barely slept, her mind still circling the crates of brass and lead, the iron bolt Julian had unfastened with such ease, the cold authority in his voice as he'd left her locked cellar behind. She dressed in her plainest wool and made her way to the great assembly hall that afternoon at Mrs. Pruitt's insistence, told only that her testimony regarding the missing stores might be required before the gathered officials. The hall had been transformed since she'd last seen it emptied for supper. Long tables stood arranged before the hearth, occupied now by 2 solemn auditors in dark coats and a magistrate whose powdered wig sat slightly askew beneath his stern expression. Servants and estate workers crowded the room's edges, murmuring amongst themselves, while Sterling himself stood before the gathered officials, his hands bound loosely at the wrist, his composure remarkably intact for a man caught so thoroughly in his own theft. "The kitchen accounts have been in disarray for months," Sterling was saying as Nora entered, his voice pitched to Carrie, his eyes finding hers across the room with a flicker of cold calculation. "I'd wager the true source of the estate's losses lies closer to the pantry than the ledgers I've kept faithfully for a decade. Ask Miss Vane herself how carelessly she's managed her own stores." A ripple of uncertain murmuring passed through the assembled servants. Nora felt her face flush hot with anger rather than shame, opening her mouth to answer the accusation directly when the hall's great doors swung open behind her, and every voice in the room fell, suddenly, completely silent. Julian walked through the doorway, and Nora barely recognized him. Gone was the threadbare wool coat, the limestone dust, the quiet stoop of a man accustomed to hauling stone from dawn until dark. In its place stood a figure dressed in tailored velvet, the deep green of old forest, a fine linen cravat at his throat, his boots polished to a shine that caught the hearth's firelight. A crest hung stitched upon his breast that Nora recognized at once from the carved stone above the keep's own great gate, the very crest of the estate itself.
"Your Grace," the magistrate said, rising so quickly his chair scraped loud against the floor, and every servant in the hall dropped into a bow or curtsy so sudden and complete that Nora found herself the only soul left standing upright, too stunned to move. Duke Julian Vance crossed the hall with unhurried steps, the same measured calm she'd watched him carry across a quarry yard and a broken bridge alike, though now it carried an authority that needed no explanation from anyone present. "5 months ago," he said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the silent hall, "I returned from abroad to find this estate's accounts in a state my own steward assured me was ordinary winter shortfall. I did not believe him." His gaze passed briefly, deliberately, over Sterling's suddenly ashen face. "So I chose to see my own estate as it truly runs, rather than as it is reported to me from behind a comfortable desk." A murmur ran through the gathered crowd, disbelief and understanding chasing each other across dozens of faces at once. Nora stood frozen amid it, her mind reeling backward through 5 months of quiet suppers, calloused hands, careful sketches by firelight, every moment rearranging itself now around a single, staggering truth. "I took a laborer's coat and a false name," Julian continued, "and worked among my own quarrymen and stonemasons as one of their own, that I might see with my own eyes where my fortune truly went, and who among my staff might be trusted with the truth of it." His eyes found Nora's across the hall, something almost apologetic in the set of his mouth. "I did not expect to find so sharp a set of eyes counting flour sacks against me as well." Sterling's composure finally cracked. "You cannot prove," he began, but Julian cut him off with a single raised hand.
"The cellar crates prove themselves well enough," he said. "Brass and lead purchased for this estate's expansion, hidden behind wine casks rather than delivered to the builders who needed them. Timber and iron logged as lost between dock and keep, sold instead to buyers willing to ask no questions. 10 years of careful theft, dressed up in tidy ledgers that never once accounted for a woman's stubborn habit of counting her own stores by candlelight." The magistrate's men moved to escort Sterling from the hall, his protests dwindling to silence beneath the weight of evidence too plain to argue against any longer. The gathered crowd began to stir and murmur amongst themselves once more, the shock of the morning's revelation settling slowly into something like relief. Nora remained rooted where she stood, staring at the man she'd known as Julian, quiet and threadbare and content to eat last at the longest bench, now standing before her dressed in velvet and bearing a duke's crest upon his breast. 5 months of shared tea by a dying fire, of sharp, calculating glances and careful, unspoken understanding,
and not once had she guessed the truth sitting quietly across from her the whole while. He looked at her now across the crowded hall, and for the first time since she'd known him, something like uncertainty crossed his composed features, as though her opinion of him mattered rather more in this moment than anything the magistrate or auditors might yet decide. Nora turned without a word and walked from the hall, her heart too full of anger and betrayal to trust herself to speak. Nora found the stables long before she found her own composure, the cold evening air doing little to cool the anger burning through her chest.
She busied herself brushing down one of the estate's carriage horses, a task requiring no thought at all, grateful for the mindless rhythm of it, while her thoughts churned in furious circles. 5 months. 5 months of watching him eat crusts and wash his own bowl, of sharing tea in a ruined mill, of trusting him with her own quiet suspicions about Sterling's theft, and never once had he thought her worthy of the truth. She heard his footsteps on the gravel before she turned to face him, still dressed in the fine velvet coat, though he'd left the powdered formality of the hall behind, and walked toward her now with something closer to the careful, unhurried gait she remembered from the quarry.
"You might have told me," Nora said before he'd come close enough to speak first. "All those months, Julian. Or ought I call you your grace now, since apparently that was always the truer name?"
"Julian will do," he said quietly. "It always did."
"Don't."
Her voice cracked sharper than she intended, and she set down the brush to face him fully, the horse forgotten between them.
"Don't pretend the name meant anything honest, when everything else about you was a lie built to deceive an entire estate."
"Not everything," he said, and something in his tone made her pause despite herself. "The tea in the mill was honest enough. The archway sketches, the bridge, all of it was true labor, true calculation. I did not lie about the man I am, Nora, only about the coat I wore while being him."
"A fine distinction," she said bitterly, "for those of us who worked double hours believing our steward's cruelty was simply the way of things, while you watched it happen from the very same bench."
Saying nothing. That struck something in him. He looked away toward the darkening hills for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its careful evenness. "You're right to be angry. I watched Sterling drive the kitchen girls near to collapse some nights, watched the stonemasons work through injuries no honest steward would have permitted, and said nothing, because speaking would have unmasked me before I'd gathered proof enough to remove him properly. I told myself the silence served a greater end. I am not certain now that it excuses what it cost the honest folk beneath him."
"It cost more than you know," Nora said. "Tabitha's hands blistered raw from scrubbing pots meant for 2 extra girls Sterling never hired to save the wages for himself. The stonemasons went without proper boots half the winter because he claimed the estate couldn't spare the cost. You walked among us 5 months, Julian."
And called it observation. We called it simply surviving. He was silent long enough that Nora thought he might offer no answer at all, and found herself almost disappointed when he finally spoke, as though some part of her had wanted him to have no defense whatsoever, nothing to soften the full weight of her anger.
"I did not think through what my silence would cost the people working beside me," he admitted. "I thought only of catching Sterling with evidence too plain to argue against, and I was so intent upon that single purpose that I let good people suffer beneath a cruelty I could have ended months sooner had I simply revealed myself the moment I suspected him. That failing is mine to carry, and I don't ask you to excuse it easily." Something in his plain admission loosened the tightest knot of Nora's anger, though it did not dissolve it entirely.
She folded her arms against the cold and studied him properly for the first time since the grand hall, no longer the quiet laborer, not quite the velvet-clad duke either, but some uncertain figure caught between the two, asking for something she wasn't yet ready to give freely.
"What is it you want from me now, Julian?" she asked. "Forgiveness offered on command the moment you ask prettily enough?"
"No," he said. "I want your help, if you'll still consider giving it.
though I understand if 5 months of deception have spent whatever trust you once offered me freely." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded sheaf of papers, offering them toward her with a steadiness that didn't quite mask the uncertainty beneath it. "These are my true plans for the estate. A new kitchen, built properly this time, with proper ventilation and room enough that no cook need manage 40 men from a single cramped hearth. A new wing for the servants besides, with decent quarters and fair wages set down in writing, so no future steward can starve good people quietly while dressing the theft up as thrift." Nora took the papers hesitantly, unfolding them by the last of the evening light. The architectural drawings within were unmistakably his hand, the same careful precision she'd glimpsed by firelight at the mill, though rendered now in full and confident detail, rather than a laborer's stolen moments of study. "You drew all this," she said, "while pretending to know nothing beyond hauling stone." "I drew all this," he agreed, "because it was the truest thing I did in 5 months of pretending. I would like your eye on it, Nora, before any of it becomes more than paper. You understand this estate's kitchens and its people better than any architect I might otherwise hire, myself included." She studied the plans a long while in silence, torn between the ache of betrayal still fresh in her chest and the plain, undeniable care evident in every careful line he'd drawn. She did not offer forgiveness outright, not yet, but she folded the papers back together with rather more care than her anger alone would have permitted, and found herself, despite everything, unable to hand them back entirely unconsidered. Nora did not return the drawings that evening, nor the next, though she told herself for 2 full days that she meant to hand them back unread. By the 3rd morning, she had marked 6 corrections along the kitchen's proposed layout in her own careful hand, and by the time she realized what she'd done, there seemed little point pretending she hadn't already agreed to help him. She found Julian in his private study on the 147th day, the same locked room where she'd once watched him through a keyhole, cross-referencing her stolen glances at his true work. The door stood open now, the fine mahogany desk cluttered with papers rather than hidden behind a turned key, and Julian looked up from his seat with something like careful hope when she entered without knocking. "You kept the plans longer than I expected," he said. "I found fault with your ventilation," she answered, setting the drawings before him with rather more force than the moment strictly required. "A kitchen that size needs a second flue, else you'll roast your cooks alive come August. And your servants' wing wants proper drainage beneath the floor, unless you mean the girls' quarters to flood every spring thaw the way the old dairy always did." Something eased in his expression at her tone, brisk and practical rather than cold, and he drew a fresh sheet toward himself to mark her corrections without argument. "Show me," he said simply, and for the first time since the grand hall, they settled into work together, as though the 5 months of secrecy between them had narrowed, if not vanished outright, into something more like uneasy partnership. They spent that day and the 2 following bent over his desk, Nora's kitchen ledgers spread alongside his structural surveys, building between them a fuller account of Sterling's theft than either had managed alone. Her tally of missing flour and beef matched precisely against the dates his own investigation had marked as suspicious deliveries. His notes on vanished quarry stone lined up against the timber and iron the barge captain swore he'd delivered honestly. Piece by piece, the 2 separate threads of evidence they'd gathered independently over 5 long months wove themselves into a single ledger too thorough for any court to dismiss. "Here," Nora said on the 2nd afternoon, tapping a column of figures with her finger. "Sterling logged 3 barrels of salted butter as spoiled and disposed of in November, yet I never once saw a spoiled cask brought up from the cellar for burning. If they were truly ruined, where did they go?" Julian studied the entry, then drew out a separate sheet, listing goods recovered from the hidden crates behind the wine casks. "Sold," he said grimly, "alongside the brass and lead. A local merchant, 3 villages over, has been buying more salted butter and preserved meat than any household could reasonably use, paying well above market rate for goods he never questioned the origin of." Then he ought to answer for it as well, Nora said. Buying stolen goods knowingly is no small matter. The magistrate will want proof of the merchant's knowledge before charging him, Julian said. But your ledger gives us dates, and dates give us a pattern no honest accident could explain. He glanced up at her with something like genuine admiration. You've built a stronger case in 3 days than my own auditors managed in as many weeks. I've counted flour since I was old enough to reach the pantry shelf, Nora said, allowing herself the ghost of a smile, despite the seriousness of the work. It's a smaller talent than architecture, I'll grant, but a useful one when a man thinks himself clever enough to steal from a kitchen no one watches closely. By the 3rd day, the combined ledger sat complete before them, a thorough record spanning every missing sack of flour, every unaccounted timber beam, every hidden crate of brass and lead, cross-referenced against dates and deliveries in a manner that left no reasonable doubt as to Sterling's guilt, nor the scope of what he'd stolen across a full decade of quiet management. Julian's men had already located the merchant's warehouse 3 villages over, and the recovered goods there, combined with what remained hidden in Oakhaven's own cellars, promised to return a substantial portion of the estate's losses. This will save Oakhaven from ruin, Julian said quietly, studying the finished ledger with something like relief plain on his face. Another year of theft at this scale, and I'd have inherited debts enough to lose the estate outright, whatever crest hung over the gate. That it's fortunate, Nora said, that a common cook happened to count her own flour rather carefully. He looked up at that, and something passed between them that hadn't been there since the mill, some easing of the careful distance she'd kept since the Grand Hall's revelation. Not so common a cook, he said. I've met few men with your head for figures, Nora, titled or otherwise. She felt the warmth of the compliment despite herself, though she kept her expression carefully neutral, unwilling to surrender her guard entirely after 5 months spent, however unknowingly, being studied rather than simply known. Flattery won't undo 5 months of silence, she said, though without the sharp edge her words had carried in the stable yard. No, Julian agreed. But perhaps honest work toward setting things right might, in time, count for something toward the same end. Nora gathered the finished ledger carefully, its pages thick with evidence enough to end Sterling's freedom and recover what he'd stolen, and found herself, despite every reasonable caution, rather looking forward to whatever came next. Silas Sterling stood trial before the county magistrate within the fortnight. The combined ledger Nora and Julian had built together laid out plain before the court, alongside the recovered brass and lead and the merchant's own confession, once faced with dates too precise to argue against. He was stripped of his position and his freedom both. The estate's stolen fortune recovered near in full from the warehouse 3 villages over, and Oakhaven settled at last into a quiet that Nora had not felt since her first uncertain night in its fog-shrouded kitchens. Julian did not waste the calm that followed. Within a month, he had reorganized the estate's administration entirely, dismissing the harshest of Sterling's overseers and raising the wages of every servant who had worked double hours under the old steward's cruelty, without complaint. The stonemasons received proper boots before the worst of the winter set in. Tabitha and the other kitchen girls found their duties divided sensibly among enough hands that no single girl scrubbed pots meant for 3. On the 150th day, Nora was summoned to the Duke's study once more, though this time she came without dread, curious rather than wary of what awaited her behind the once-locked door. Julian stood by the window when she entered, a folded document resting on the desk before him, and for a moment he seemed almost as uncertain as he had in the stable yard weeks before, when he'd first offered her his true plans for the estate. "I've been considering," he said, "what role best suits a woman who counts flour with an auditor's precision and builds a case against theft sturdier than my own men managed in weeks of trying." "I'm content enough in the kitchens," Nora said, though curiosity had already sharpened her attention toward the document on his desk. "I don't doubt you'd manage them admirably another 20 years, Julian said. "But Oakhaven needs rather more than a skilled cook now that Sterling's mismanagement lies exposed. It needs someone who understands every thread running through this estate. Provisions, materials, ledgers, the honest cost of running a household this size without a steward skimming from every corner of it. He turned the document toward her, and Nora read the words slowly, twice over, before she trusted herself to believe them plainly written rather than some trick of hopeful imagination. A contract, signed already in Julian's own hand, appointing her Chief Logistics Steward of Oakhaven Keep, with full authority over the estate's provisions, its material accounts, and the fair treatment of every servant working beneath her charge. "You're offering me Sterling's position?" she said, still staring at the paper as though it might rearrange itself into something less improbable.
"I'm offering you a position built properly this time," Julian said, "with wages set fairly and authority earned rather than simply inherited by title. You'll answer to no one's cruelty in managing it, least of all mine." Nora set the contract down with hands not quite steady, torn between the plain joy of the offer and the lingering weight of 5 months spent, however unknowingly, being studied by the very man now offering her authority over his household. "And if I sign it," she said carefully, "am I to trust that the man behind this desk is truly the one I've come to know these past weeks, and not some further disguise waiting to be revealed?" Something gentled in Julian's expression at that, an honesty plainer than any velvet coat or careful title could offer. "No more disguises, Nora. I gave you my true name in a ruined mill 5 months ago, and my true plans in a stable yard weeks past. Whatever comes next, you'll have it plain, or not at all." She studied him a long moment more, weighing the quiet man who'd washed his own bowl in the darkest corner of the mess hall against the Duke who stood before her now, and found, at last, that the distance between the two had narrowed enough to trust. She signed the contract with a steady hand, and Julian's answering smile carried none of the careful reserve she'd known him by for 5 long months. That evening, the great hall filled once more for supper, though transformed now from the chaotic mess she'd first commanded on her very first night at Oakhaven. The new kitchen wing stood half-finished already, its proper flues drawing smoke cleanly rather than choking the cooks who worked beneath it, and the servants ate at tables set with rather more comfort than Sterling's stinginess had ever permitted. Julian arrived once the meal was well underway, dressed plainly rather than in velvet, and crossed the hall not toward the head table set aside for him, but toward the long bench where the stonemasons and ironworkers still sat, exactly as he had on Nora's very first evening at Oakhaven 5 months before. He took the seat at the very end, in the same corner he'd always claimed as a quiet laborer, and this time, rather than eating in silence and slipping away unnoticed into the fog, he waited until Nora herself brought the stew and gestured for her to sit across from him, rather than return at once to her duties. "Breaking tradition, Your Grace?" she asked, though warmth rather than sharpness colored the question now. "Only the parts worth breaking," Julian said, and there, in the same corner where she'd first noticed a quiet man finishing crusts no one else wanted, they shared a meal openly at last, no coat to hide behind, no title to keep distance between them, only the honest beginning of whatever Oakhaven Keep might yet become, under 2 steady hands working as equals rather than master and servant. The fires burned warm through the great hall that night, and for the first time since her arrival, Nora Vane sat at Oakhaven's longest table, feeling entirely and gladly at home.